Welcome to Mr. Foy's Easel. On this program, I'm going to be talking about fables, and particularly one fable. Fables are really just stories, you know. One character that you may remember, I've drawn him on this program several times, is Claude Crow. And he had a little nephew that sometimes came to visit him for a few days. And he liked to read stories or fables to him at bedtime. And so, well, let's take a look at Claude and his nephew at story time. Well, Claude has got his book out, and he's just finished reading a story that dates a long way back to a poet named, or a writer named Aesop. It was a story about a race, a famous race between a hare, which is kind of like a rabbit, and a tortoise, which is a sort of kin to turtles. Anyhow, just to sum it up, the hare thought he was going to win, but he got so overconfident that he rested and fell asleep, and the tortoise jogged on by him and won the race. So here we are with Claude and his nephew, and the little guy says, "Uncle Claude, has there ever been a time when the hare or the rabbit actually won?" And Claude says, "No, I don't recollect, but I do remember a story about a turtle and a friend who was actually a rabbit. Turtle and a rabbit, good friends. And it so happened that just like I've been reading from this book, one day the turtle, whose name was Timmy, was sitting outside near his house reading a book of fables. And he actually read that same story about the tortoise and the hare. And just as he was finishing up that particular story, his friend Rodney Rabbit came running down the road. He waved his hand and he said, "Hey, pal," said, "what you reading?" And Timmy's engrossed in a book of fables or stories. And he looked up when he saw his friend standing there, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you, I just finished this interesting story about a tortoise and a hare, and how the tortoise managed to win that race. The hare, you see, was overconfident or something." And anyway, Rodney's standing there taking all that in, and then all of a sudden, he burst out laughing. He just said, "Ho, ho, now that is really a tall story." He says, "I can't believe that. A hare losing a race to a tortoise? Boy, that is something. That would be like, well, it would be like you beating me in a race." And then he kept laughing. Well, as I said before, these two were good friends. And yet, Rodney's attitude and his laughing at the story, or laughing at the possibility he might lose to his pal in a race. Anyway, that kind of bothered Timmy, and he said, "Now, how do you know that you would win over me in a race?" And of course, Rodney was pretty smug about it, and they discussed it, and finally Rodney said, "Well, why don't we race, and I'll show you." And so they made plans, and they told their friends, and they set up a starting line and a finishing line. And a week and a half or so after this discussion out in the yard, the race started. And Timmy, of course, being a turtle, was pretty slow, and he'd made only a few steps when Rodney went past him so fast I'll tell you how fast it was. It was kind of like the Road Runner that a lot of you have seen on cartoons. He kicked up a lot of dust, and Timmy he knew his friend Rodney could run fast, but he didn't know he was quite that fast. But Timmy didn't stay ruffled. He didn't worry about it. In fact, he thought, well, since it's early in the race, I'll just sit here on a rock, and he was curious about what time it was. He had a meeting later in the day. Well, we'll take a short break, and then we'll return to this great race and see what happened.
Home security is now available through Conway Corp. It's an advanced solution backed by people you know and trust. Customize your system with motion detectors, sensors, light controls, and more, all managed from your wireless touchscreen or mobile phone. It's an easy way to protect the things that matter and the ones who matter most. It's safety for you, powered by Conway Corp.
Well, welcome back. Well, as I've told you, Rodney was well on his way, several yards ahead of Timmy at the time he sat down to check his watch. But Rodney was curious about how far ahead he was. He came to a sudden screeching halt, you might say. And he looked back and was puzzled. He saw his opponent just sitting there instead of running, not even trying. And so this prompted Rodney to double back. He knew he felt confident that he won't have any trouble finishing the race. So he runs back to Timmy and says, "Hey man, what are you doing? You're just sitting there. You ought to at least try. Have you given up? Oh, and by the way, what's that you got in your hand?" Well, Timmy said, "This is a watch that my grandpa gave me for my birthday years ago, and I just like to take it out and look at it. It's such a nice watch. It's very valuable." And well, Rodney couldn't resist taking a closer look at the watch. And as he started looking at it, Timmy kept talking to him and telling about how expensive it was and blah, blah. And he kept swaying that watch back and forth, back and forth. And Rodney, he found he couldn't take his eyes off of it. He just stared at it. And Timmy kept swaying the watch, holding it by the chain, back and forth, back and forth. Well, some of you have probably already figured out what's happened here. Take a look. Rodney became totally hypnotized. Take a look at his eyes there. He doesn't know. He doesn't know where he is or where he's going or anything. Timmy put his watch in his pocket and sauntered off, headed toward the finish line. And as he was leaving this area, he said to his friend, says, "Rodney, why don't you go home and eat some carrots or something?" And that's exactly what Rodney did. He scampered off, and somewhat like the original story that Claude was reading for his nephew, he won the race. So the rabbit, not the hare, but the rabbit loses again. And by the way, even though Timmy tricked Rodney and went on to win the race, the two remained friends. In fact, Timmy received a trophy as being the winner, and you know what he did the that afternoon he went over to Rodney's house and said, "Here, you keep the trophy. You should have won." And they remained friends, by the way. We may hear more about these two guys later on in another story involving Claude Crow and other critters. By the way, there are a lot of stories, many of which are like the tortoise and the hare story, dating back a long, long way, and they all have some kind of lesson in it, which you can either take to heart or not. Here's some pictures from 3 of those stories. There was one about the grasshopper and the ant, and it goes like this. The ant was very busy, always working. You've often heard people speak of just how industrious ants are. If you see them out in the field, they're not lying around, you know. They're really busy. Of course, this is a cartoon of an ant. That's supposed to be a soda cracker. And he's working hard at it, and the grasshopper's just having a good time and not paying any attention to being busy or working. And at the end of the story, the grasshopper is facing a long, cold winter, and he doesn't have food stored up, and the ant does. So, you know, there's a lesson there. And over to the right, there's the one about the fox and the grapes. And there was this fox, and he saw some delicious-looking grapes hanging from a vine which was way up high, out of reach. And according to the story, by the way, this story, all of these were from Aesop, the writer that I mentioned earlier. And finally, the fox, after trying unsuccessfully to even touch the grapes, let alone get them down from the vine, he just gave up and he walked away. And according to the old story, he said to himself, says, "Oh, those grapes, I don't want them. They were probably sour anyway." And from that story, we get the expression sour grapes, which means that if you don't get something you're after, you might just say, well, it wasn't worth getting anyhow. Now down here at the bottom, we have a lion and a mouse, and it looks like they're on friendly terms. And they are, because according to the old story, well, the old story started out, the lion had caught the mouse and was about to have him for his lunch. And the mouse put up a hard story and says, "If you'll let me go, I'll never get in your way again, and I'll do you a favor sometime." Well, the lion did so, and then later on, the lion got caught in a trap and was down in a hole in the ground in a net. And the mouse came down, and with his sharp teeth, he chewed the ropes that made up the net, and the lion got free, and they were friends ever since. By the way, there are a lot of fables that you can find in the library. Good summer reading. There's lots of other reading you can do. But anyway, that's a story about it. 1 or 2 races, and an admonition from me is to read more about these things, and they're a lot of fun.
Home security is now available through Conway Corp. It's an advanced solution backed by people you know and trust. Customize your system with motion detectors, sensors, light controls, and more, all managed from your wireless touchscreen or mobile phone. It's an easy way to protect the things that matter and the ones who matter most. It's safety for you, powered by Conway Corp.